Welcome, and thank you for joining us today on the Heroes and Icons podcast. I'm your host, Greg Randolph. Please find me on the X at Greg Heroes Icons, as well as my new website, heroesandiconspodcast.com, to get updates for great shows like this and others. I'm also a featured podcaster on HoustonCityBeat.com. That's a cool website for happenings and local businesses in the Houston area. Please check them out as well. If you're enjoying the show, please, it would help me out a whole lot if you would please share it with a friend. Thank you in advance for doing that. We have a very special guest today. He is the author of the amazing book, Run to the Fire, The True Story of Rick Collins. The book's foreword was graciously written by Vietnam vet and NFL Hall of Fame quarterback Roger Staubach. Rick Collins, a Vietnam veteran whose body was maimed by battle, returned home to extreme tragedy and loss. An unlikely superhero, he blazed a standard of endurance, faithfulness, and sacrifice to be emulated. Living an intentional path of extraordinary purpose, Rick rescued those in need, fought for the voiceless, served his community faithfully, and changed the world around him, blazing a legacy for generations to come. Rick's story will inspire you and challenge you to be the type of person that, when faced with impossible odds, will run to the fire. My guest today is college fraternity brother, business mogul, the CEO of Corganics, and Run to the Fire author, Chad Collins. A tremendous honor to have you on the show with me. Chad, how you doing today? What's keeping you busy, and how's the family doing?
Thanks, Greg. Really appreciate being on. It's always good to be with a fellow brother Fiji, and then also a Red Raider. Things are great in our Collins household. Lots going on with my family. So that keeps us busy along with my organization. We stay really busy in the Collins household, that's for sure.
That's great to hear. And you have a couple kids that are at Tech now. Is that at Texas Tech? Is that correct?
Yeah, I've had one, my oldest just graduated with his MBA from Texas Tech. He actually got his undergrad at the University of Tulsa.
Right.
He was a football player and finance major there, and then got his MBA at Texas Tech. His younger brother, my middle child, Chief, is at Texas Tech right now. So he's starting his senior year. He's also a Red Raider football player, so it's a lot of fun going to watch the Red Raiders all over the place. And then my youngest, our daughter, just graduated from high school, and she'll be a Red Raider starting this August when she starts at school there in Lubbock.
I love to hear that.
So hopefully have all three graduate from Texas Tech. That'll be a cool thing.
Absolutely. Let's start in with the book, with Run to the Fire. So when did you make the decision to write the book, and what prompted you to be sure that your dad's story was told?
I appreciate that question. I get asked a lot, how long did it take you to write it and stuff like that? But really, that I had been thinking about writing a book about my dad really as long as I can really remember. I had a really unique setting of watching him grow up, or watching me growing up, and watching how he lived his life. And so I always knew he was a hero, really a superhero to me, and then all the people around us. And so growing up, I always thought, man, so many people could benefit hearing his story, and not only people that kind of grew up around him or family or friends that watched him every day as a role model, but how could I help tell his story? And even when he was still alive, I was able to tell his story with him in a number of different settings around schools and other organizations that were looking for a great, I'll call it a hero story, somebody who has risen beyond their challenges and got back up. When did I decide truly to write the book? I probably as an adult, the last 10 plus years of watching my dad, knowing that at some point that we were going to lose him. Mm-hmm. I just knew that, probably when he passed, I would probably take the appropriate time to write a story that we think can really impact people's lives. There's no question about that, in a lot of different ways. And so my dad passed in December of 2020.
Right.
And I probably the next year or so was really started thinking about that book, obviously reflecting in my own grief of losing my best friend and my hero, and then started to really put pen to paper. And so I used the stories that I witnessed firsthand, and then also stories from his family and dear friends to really formulate this book. And then wrote it, took about a year to write, and then launched the book about a year and a half ago.
Let me ask you about how football influenced your dad and how football molded Rick Collins into who he ultimately became. And, yeah, I guess I think at a young age, we all need a different way an outlet, if you will, to channel some aggression and not aggression, but just some youth angst, if you will. And to have something like football, to have a coach or a mentor at that time, it really helped him a lot. If I'm
Oh yeah,
reading that.
yeah, yeah. Without question. For my dad grew up a really interesting background. Didn't have a dad really, so he's really raised by his mom, really young teenage mom, in fact, and his grandparents, and really surrounded by uncles that were really strong male role models, and didn't grow up with a whole lot. And one of the things that my dad would do, he was an ornery kid, got into a lot of trouble as a youth. And football and his coaches in the Mesquite School District really are the ones that really what he would give a lot of credit to early in his life, gave him an outlet for aggression. My dad was a tough guy, probably didn't shy away from many fights, whether that was in the streets of Dallas or Mesquite, Texas. But football was one of those areas that he had some really strong role models in the coaches that he had, really from middle school into high school. And those were relationships he actually carried throughout his entire life until many of them had passed themselves. But football was one of his ways. He was very talented in it. He probably loved the physicality of it, which probably helped him later in life tackle some of his obstacles for sure. And football for him, whether it was offense or defense, he lived his life like he was on the 2 yard line. And if you know football, you know that if you're on offense and you're on the 2 yard line, you know you got to punch it in. You don't get many opportunities and you've got to deliver. The opposite side of that is if you're on defense and you're on the 2 yard line, you are doing everything you've got to do, scratching, clawing, doing everything you can to keep the opponent from scoring. And so if you think about the mentality of living life on the 2 yard line, where everything really is important, knowing what you've got to do to get through to whatever that next play is, that's how he lived life. So those coaches started it. And then, and we're going to talk a little bit about his injuries and things of that nature, but when he came back from Vietnam, he was 100% disabled. And so he couldn't work. And so my mom actually went and signed him up to coach in Garland, Texas, in the youth football league there. And she did it because she knew that an outlet like that was going to be a great outlet for him. He always bragged about his coaches and those relationships and how much they meant to him. And so if he could turn that and give back to youth, he wanted to do that. So many times people get into youth coaching because they have kids playing. My dad didn't have any kids yet old enough to play any sports. So he was coaching well before he could ever coach me personally, and then even coached after that. And so he loved teaching the game of football. But more than that, he was teaching character traits and just leadership and how you come together as a team in football. So even for me growing up, I can remember almost as one of my earliest memories of life was being by his side, watching him coach football, take me to high school games, take me to college games, and watching football all the time. It meant a great deal to him. And then for myself, I fell in love with the game of football, and my dad coached me as a youth. He was every one of my practices. He was at every one of my games all the way through, even get to play a little bit at Texas Tech early in my college life. And then his grandsons, my two boys, He was at literally every practice and every game of theirs also for all of their youth. And those two kids, like I mentioned, playing college football now, my dad, Rick Collins, was a huge influence on that. And I can talk about, Roger Staubach and heroes of his. He grew up in the Dallas area.
Right.
So it was first the Dallas Texans and then the Dallas Cowboys. And so he would talk about one of the greatest things for him growing up was going to the Cotton Bowl, the old Cotton Bowl,
Sure.
and watching the Dallas Texans play. And that was obviously the professional team at the time, and then the Dallas Cowboys. In 1970, when my dad had actually gotten hurt a second time, he had actually been hit by a bus, which is just crazy to even say those words, but he was run over by a bus while in a vehicle and spent about 6 months in the VA hospital in Dallas. And one of the visitors that he had on multiple occasions there was Roger Staubach. Roger Staubach was a young player with the Dallas Cowboys, had been drafted, had served some time in the Navy after his Naval Academy graduation. He had obviously won the Heisman Trophy. As you mentioned, he was in Vietnam as well. And Roger Staubach would come to the VA hospital in Dallas without any fanfare, without an entourage, and he would walk up and down the hallways and just peek ahead into rooms, ask if it was okay to come in and visit. And my dad would tell you that meant such an incredible amount to all those young soldiers who were new coming back from Vietnam, a lot of them recovering, or others that maybe from Korea or World War II that happened to need health care from the VA at the time. And Roger Staubach would come and sit for hours at a time in the rooms of these young soldiers like my dad. And that meant an incredible amount for somebody like of his stature to go do that. And when I was writing the book, one of the things that I always thought about is, man, could I have a Roger Staubach write the foreword of a book? And had some connections to him through a close family friend. And long story short, he became the author of that first section of the book that really is pretty inspiring just to listen to his and read his words about my dad and stuff. It's pretty cool.
You pretty much answered what I was going to ask, but my next question was, how important is football to your family? Yeah, I think you answered that pretty well.
Yeah. It's funny. We definitely are in a football family, but I think it goes beyond what we think about the X's and O's. I think it's why football has been so important. It literally is the dichotomy of life. You're going to get knocked down and you got to get back up. You got to figure out a way to get back up. And it's not always on your own. You've got a successful football team has got to depend on a number of players on every single play. In fact, all 11 have got to be pulling together in the same direction for something positive really to happen. And life is really football. And my dad not only loved the game of football, but loved the game of life and how those two areas parallel each other. And so there's not a whole lot of sports where you get knocked down, your face might be in the mud, kicked, and every other thing that you can imagine. And you got to enjoy it enough that you're going to get back up and do it again, the next play over and over again. And then the grueling aspect of wearing a helmet and pads and just the pounding that your body takes and maybe the screams of coaches and still love it. Football for our family was something pretty special. And so even for my kids, I think they fell in love with it at a very early age. And their papa, my dad, was such a huge catalyst of that as well. They loved to go to games with him. One of the things that we loved is my dad would cheer for every single player on a team, for example, on my teams and my kids' teams. And there was something just special. Football was more than just a team. It was a family, no matter which team it was. And my dad valued family so much. He valued being on a team so much. And one of the things that he always stressed for myself and my boys was the value of being an incredible teammate and also being coachable.
Mhm.
And if you're a great teammate, you know what your role is, and you take that role and you love it, and you put a lot of pride into it. No matter if you're on the offensive line or defensive line, or you don't get your name called a whole lot, or you're not in the paper, that doesn't matter. If you're a really good teammate, you're going to pull for everybody on your team. You're going to do whatever you need to help the team, which also means being very coachable. And so he taught us how to be coachable and to understand that we don't have all the answers, whether in football or in life. And it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to ask for guidance. And those are some of the things that there's so many parallels to football that we learned for life lessons in our family. And those are part of what we tell in that story of the book, Run to the Fire, for sure. But football is it's I hate to say it that we don't idolize football. God and Jesus are front and center for our family, but faith and our family and football, those three F's really do go together in a Collins household for sure.
And you mentioned about the 2 yard line, but how if you're on offense, you got to punch it in. If you're on defense, you got to stuff them right there. But to me, with what your dad was able to overcome, he was put on the two, but he was on offense and having to drive 98 yards the other way. Would you say is that accurate?
Yeah, there's no question. There's not a whole lot of human beings that I've ever met, and I'm sure there are, but and I'll tell you this, my dad would always say there's somebody that's not just worse off, probably far worse off than somebody else, or for yourself as an example for him.
Right.
But without question, he was, from the jump, didn't have the normal family structure to go into, he enlisted into the Vietnam War, enlisted into the Army,
Right.
and then had such setbacks when it came to crippling injuries that most people wouldn't have been able to survive, not just physically, but also emotionally. And especially during that time, our Vietnam veterans, which there's about 3.5 million still disabled Vietnam veterans out there right now that faced really an unpopular war. They were asked by their country to go to a foreign land, and many of them gave up not just limbs and other injuries, but also the emotional toll of coming back to the U.S. and not getting a ticker tape parade, not getting the recognition of appreciation of them wearing the uniform. And so, anyway, there's a lot of deeper meaning to me when I think about my dad and folks like him, young boys that went to Southeast Asia and left a lot of themselves there. And so, without question, my dad coming back and dealing with some significant amputee injuries and other elements of that. He lived an entire life and then the rest of his adult life dealing with severe injuries and chronic pain. And then along the way, some very emotional, catastrophic, emotional things that happened to him as well.
And the thing that really strikes me about him being in Vietnam is that he had this tremendous sense of duty and actually volunteered. And
He
he
did.
wasn't drafted, he wasn't, and he volunteered and enlisted. And
He
that
did.
that says an awful lot.
Yeah, interesting enough, I'll take you a step back. So when he was in high school, while he loved football and loved his teammates at Mesquite High School, he loved being a Mesquite Skeeter. He loved a young lady named Linda Mayhall even more. And Linda Mayhall was his childhood sweetheart. And they decided after midway through his junior year of high school, you know what? Maybe I'll start thinking about the future together. They ended up getting married
Mhm.
very early, even in high school. And my dad said, you know what? I want to build a career in the military. And so he did. He had uncles that had fought in World War II. His family thought a lot of the building a potential career in the military. And so my dad, he did. He enlisted and thought he was going to build a career in the U.S. Army. And so that's what he did. He enlisted and thought, you know what, there's a war going on. I know some people that, grew up around him that were either drafted or enlisted as well. And that's the choice he made. And even through dealing with such catastrophic injuries,
Mhm.
my dad, all the way through his entire adult life, would say he would do it again. And that tells you a lot about him around commitment to service. Even though he knew when he signed up, he knew that when you make that decision, you are going to take your life at risk, and then also risk literally limbs as well. But he was willing to do it, and he says he would have done it again, which again tells you a lot about the Rick Collins of that we knew.
Absolutely. And for most of them, if someone comes up and says, "Hey, thank you for your service," the response is often, "It was an honor to serve this country."
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, my dad thought that without question. He was honored to serve our country. He was extremely patriotic. He believed in the values that our country were founded on, and believed that those were worth fighting for, and our freedom, and not just our freedom. He was over there trying to protect and create freedom for the people of South Vietnam as well. And he believed in that and did his entire life. Even though there's a lot of controversy about that war, what's not controversial is the guys that were fighting side by side, that were in really the pits of hell in that jungle. And what he would tell you is he saw some of the greatest humanity with some of those guys that fought together. Right? They would do. Sorry, I get a little emotional talking about it, thinking
No,
about it,
it's
but
understandable.
he would just talk about that, he had guys save his life, and he would do anything to save other guys' lives as well, because he also knew that some of them didn't volunteer. But it was his duty to help protect as many as he could. And he would hope that they would do the same for him. But so there's definitely a deeper meaning for those guys that fought together and fought.
In the book, you talk about purposeful intent, about how there's so many barriers to winning the war, and they just had to do ordinary things with consistency, and that was the only way to survive. And his faith in God really brought him through it. You mentioned that your grandmother sent a Bible, is that right? And prayed for the unit. That was another thing that helped really get
Yeah.
him through.
Yeah, without question, his mom, his entire family were Christian faith, and believe that Jesus died for all of us. And his grandmother, which would be my great grandmother, gave him a Bible. And in that, she said, "I will be praying for you every day." And he would, even when he came back, that was literally the only thing my dad was able to come back from Vietnam with, was that small little Bible that she provided him.
Right.
And without question, he knew that those prayers, he had there was a meaning in life that God had for him specifically to survive Vietnam. And I'll share just a little bit around that experience. The day my dad stepped on a landmine, really lost his legs during that day, and then also took 3 rounds through the shoulder, shot 3 times. 8 of the 12 in his squad died that day. And so you think about they're eating together, sleeping together, learning about each other's families. Some of them were married, like my dad. Some of them already had kids, even though they were young. There was a purpose for my dad surviving that day. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for my dad's survival. And we thank God every single day that he allowed my dad to live
Yep.
through that catastrophic time.
Yep. It's pretty amazing. It's pretty mind-boggling how God can work in just those infinite capacities. And
Hmm.
the things that are planned decades and decades down the
Yeah,
road, if not centuries. So
that's right.
that's really amazing.
Yeah, there's definitely a plan, no doubt.
Always. You guys tell me about this, and I don't know how much you remember that day, but there's an accident and there's a fire, and your dad stops and runs to the fire. And I think that was a big inspiration for your book. And he rescues this teenage girl that's pinned against a steering wheel, and he carries her 50 yards away, leaves the scene, doesn't give his name, all that. What was the reaction of the firefighters that were called to the scene that night?
Yeah. The title of the book, "Run to the Fire," was really inbred in me that literally that evening. It was about 10 o'clock at night, and to give you a little perspective, we lived out in the country between Garland, Plano, Allen, out in the country in North Dallas area.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about 10 o'clock at night. We're driving. And this was a time when people didn't wear seatbelts. There wasn't a law to wear seatbelts. I was 5. I was actually sitting in the bench seat between my parents, and I could see this fire up
Yeah.
ahead of us. And as we closed in on that fire, there's not very many homes around at all. This is truly out in the country.
Okay.
We come up on that fire, and there wasn't a second that went by in indecisiveness from my dad. My dad tells my mom, go get help. There's a house about 300 yards away or so. And as my mom is grabbing me and my 2-year-old sister in the back seat, she has to go around to get her, but she's pulling me out of the car. I literally watch my dad, who, to give you take a step back. So my dad's loss of legs in Vietnam, obviously that's pretty catastrophic. He walked with crutches and had a really interesting gait where he couldn't walk very fast, but he had to literally swing each leg around. He walked on these crutches. And so I had never seen my dad run. I knew he was a great athlete when he was in high school and all of that, but never obviously had seen my dad run. I'd seen him as a disabled man. And at that moment, I literally watched my dad run to this engulfed fire that has literally engulfed the front of an entire vehicle. This vehicle had run into a concrete barrier at a T, really close to South Fork Ranch, which is the old Dallas house from the TV show Dallas, in fact. And as I'm getting out, I literally watched my disabled father not hesitate for a second and literally run to the fire. By the time my mom and my little sister ran to this house, somebody was on the phone there. They could see it from a distance, had called for paramedics and the fire department. By the time we run back, my dad has pulled this unconscious teenage girl. And of course, I wasn't too close. I was bawling because I thought my dad was going to pass away, run into that fire. That's all I knew was I was going to come back and my dad may not be there. My dad is leaning over this girl. Paramedics come, fire department comes from Plano. They end up they're working on the getting the fire out. The paramedics are working on this teenage girl. They revive her, get her breathing again. And I remember that night, and I just remember the paramedics and the fire department personnel just surrounding my dad. Like, you could tell my dad was disabled and had barely use of his lower legs, and they're wondering how in the world he got her out of this vehicle. She was pinned between literally the front of her car was completely collapsed.
Right.
So one of the things my dad did, because he didn't have real use of his legs, he had to lift weights all the time to keep his upper body extremely strong. And so I also used to go to the gym with my dad and watch my dad swim and lift weights. My dad broke the steering column to be able to pull this girl out. And they could not believe it, that a human could literally do that.
Right.
And a long time after, when I was much older, I was probably in my 20s, because this thing was ingrained in my mind. I asked my dad, what were you thinking? You had you lost your legs. And we'll get to this, but my dad had also lost his wife and young son after his injuries in Vietnam. My dad lost them in a car accident, and his mother-in-law, before he met my mom, and which was a whole nother story in and of itself. But my dad, without question, didn't hesitate. And I always wanted to know what was going through his mind in that split second. And his words to me were, somebody in that vehicle was loved by somebody. He didn't know who was in the vehicle. He didn't know how many were in the vehicle, but he didn't hesitate for a second to go try to save somebody's life, knowing that he could have jeopardized his own life to do it, just like he would have done in Vietnam and elsewhere. And so that was my dad. It was run to the fire. If somebody needs help, we got to figure out how we can help them. And so that, that will live with me. I can so vividly see that setting of that fire and then see that girl laying there and thinking, my dad, who's disabled,
Mm.
is an absolute hero. But he lived his life like that. It was always, we're going to get up and we're going to help somebody. We're going to be in service to somebody. And that's has had a resonating effect on our entire family, not just me, my kids and my wife and our family, but everybody that's known my dad has like taken that mantra of let's help somebody. Let's literally run to the fire. When somebody's in need, we got to help.
And he did such an amazing job of that. And so that kind of leads to my next question is how was he able to overcome such adversity in just everyday life? And you mentioned in the book how, like maybe on a slow, or maybe when we talk, that on a slow day, it takes a normal person with full capacity, maybe 5 minutes to get ready. But it took
Yeah.
him almost an hour ready. And yet he faced every day with such grace and courage.
Yeah. Really a few things. One, faith. If he didn't have the hope of God in his life and
Mhm.
all of that, he would think, why am I even doing this? And so he realized that he had there was a bigger purpose for him. The second thing is gratefulness. My dad lived a life of gratefulness, even at the smallest little victories. He was grateful for any opportunity to live. And where that really stemmed from, when he was at Brooke Army Hospital and at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, after he had been hurt, he had to spend almost a year there recovering. And here he was, he's been shot multiple times. He had malaria that he had to overcome because of blood transfusions. He got malaria. He's lost legs. He's had all these surgeries, etc. He even had physicians telling him, you won't ever be able to walk. And my dad sat in a hospital bed watching other guys, and maybe they lost all four of their limbs. He
Right.
listened to the young men, and they were really boys, that were burned 90% of their body at Fort Sam Houston. And he could hear them crying all night long. And my dad remembers thinking, God has a purpose for me, and my injuries and what I'm going to deal with is not near as bad as what they're going to deal with. And right then along that line was he turned that into a positive thought process of it can always be worse.
Yep.
I've got to find the good in the darkness, etc. The other thing, that gratefulness was important. And then it was also love of family. And one of the things he credits his ability to get back up off the mat, if you will, or
Sure.
off the field, back up, was his family in Dallas would caravan about 7 hours down to San Antonio. And they would do that every weekend. His mom, his what became his stepdad, his cousins, his aunts, uncles, his wife, and her family, they would literally caravan from Dallas to San Antonio to see him every weekend over the course of about 11 months in his recovery. And what he found in that was while guys that came back from Vietnam, they weren't really accepted a whole lot for where they had been and what they had been doing, but his family loved him like crazy. And he knew that if he was worth it to them, that
Mhm.
he had a duty to fight for them as well, to get back up and to live as productive and positive a life as he possibly could. He felt like he owed that to them. He felt like he owed it to God because of a second chance, and he owed it to his family for loving him so much and surrounding him with encouragement and positivity. That was a big catalyst for him. And then later on, when he lost his wife and his son and his mother-in-law in a car accident, he hit as low in the bottom, if you will, at that point in his life, and still, by the grace of God, figured out a way to get back up. And then he ended up meeting my mom, having my sister and I as
Yep.
kids, and lived just an incredible life. But those three things, it was really faith,
Mhm.
his gratefulness, and his family
Right.
are the three things that helped him get back up and persevere and just stay positive on the path for the rest of his life.
And then in the book, there's this. I'm going to tell you this before I forget about it, but there's a picture in the book of your dad. It's a black and white, and you can just see it in his face that he has this great relationship with the Lord, and you can really just see that in him.
No question. I think it's why. See, there you go again, Greg. You got me. There's no question. I became a Christian because of, I always thought if somebody could endure what my dad endured and then see the positive and know that God had a plan, it was very simple for me, even personally, and all the people I was around, that God meant so much to him and the grace that he provided, that my dad knew that he could never have gotten up without the Lord. And so if you ever saw my dad or anybody that knew, my dad lived in chronic pain for walking all those years with all those injuries and stuff. But he always had a smile on his face. He always saw the positive in everything. He was the most empathetic person you could ever meet. And he was so fun to be around. So I lived in, my dad never complained. You can't imagine. I complain about a bunch of things, small things at times. We
Yep.
all do.
Yep.
My dad never complained. And I thought, my goodness, God had such an incredible mission for my dad to be such a role model for others and to help him through all those things as a beacon of light for what it can mean if you have that relationship with the Lord, and then take advantage of that by living a positive life. And anyway, yeah, anybody that ever met my dad would say he is one of the kindest, sweetest, nicest men that they had ever met. And sometimes they didn't know all his background
Right.
and what he was carrying,
Yep.
both physically and emotionally, and never let that set him back. Doesn't mean that he didn't grieve, because boy,
Mhm.
he would tell you he grieved. And there was a point in time where he was asking God and questioning God, why did you take the love of my life and my son? Those he found a lot of hope in them, after he got hurt. He never questioned God about getting hurt, like through the Vietnam War or getting hit by a bus. He always said that, look, I'm the one that made that decision to go to Vietnam. I knew what I was signing up for. Where he questioned was when his wife and son, when he lost them. But then over time, it became apparent to him that there obviously was a deeper plan that God had for him, and he was able to get up. He never quit grieving his wife and son,
Yep.
but that's why he loved his new family, my family,
Right.
my sister and I, my mom.
Mhm.
He loved us so much because he was so grateful for those second chances.
For I was just going to say, for all of that, for as nice and kind and everything else he was, I don't think you'd want to be on the other side of a fight from him.
No, no, boy, I will tell you this. There is no doubt, if my dad was so loyal, and if he knew somebody was being hurt in any way, he would not, even though he had, got rid of some of the bad stuff of his youth, there was still that fight in him. He was a competitive guy, and boy, he would take care of anybody he knew that was being mistreated or anything like that. But yeah, tough and strong. In fact, I'll give you a quick story. He had so many orthopedic surgeries as an adult, both hips replaced, spine surgery, fused literally neck down, carpal tunnel surgeries on his wrist because how he walked on crutches all those years. And so he had all these surgeries and a lot of chronic pain. He also had a lot of metal in his body. And his physicians at the Carroll Clinic, one of the best orthopedic practices on the planet, I tell you, those surgeons, they loved my dad. Not just because he is putting some money in their pocket. It wasn't that. It was the fact that they loved that he attacked life. He was going to keep living life to its fullest. He was going to stay as active as he possibly could. And so he was willing to go through the pain of additional surgeries to keep him mobile and moving. They used to affectionately call him the Iron Tank. I remember Drew Dossett, Dr. Dossett was a spine surgeon there at the Carroll Clinic, and he thought the world of my dad because my dad didn't come in complaining as a patient. My dad would come in saying, look, here's the reality. I've got this issue. Is there a way to keep me moving? What can we do? And took a proactive approach as a patient, though he, obviously he didn't like hospitals and all those surgeries, but he was very proactive. So even all those surgeons to this day, and I know a lot of them, they will talk about how he was he inspired them in handling things, but he was the Iron Tank. And you definitely didn't want to mess with my dad if you didn't need to.
I feel like I know him pretty well just through you and
Yeah.
through the book, and that says an awful lot. So in the book, you mentioned that gain requires investment, and I love that statement. But he made such a great investment in the lives of hundreds as a successful baseball and football coach, and he became a mentor to them, and they were all influenced by his character and perseverance. When you hear from his former players, and you see the letters that they wrote about what a great coach and what a great man your dad was, as Rick Collins' son, how does that make you feel?
Uh, sometimes some people have different perception of, you may know somebody really well and you wonder what other people think, or are they two different types of people, or, they're one way to somebody else. And my dad was the most incredible mentor and coach to me, not just sports, but life, obviously. My dad cared about everybody. And if that included kids that he coached, he absolutely would go out of his way to spend extra time with those kids if they needed a ride to and from our practices. And and obviously you grow up in America and you've got broken homes. And so there's a fair amount of kids that I grew up with that he coached that maybe they didn't have a dad at home. And my dad was just incredible with just being able to teach life lessons, right? He wasn't a preacher, but he had a really uncanny way of people feeling very comfortable with him and being able to share if they had a problem or an issue, or just they were open to his coaching. And so there are so many young boys, especially, that he had such a profound impact on. One of the things that a lot of kids that he coached would see, my dad, because of how he walked on those crutches and walked, he'd fall a lot. So he did a lot of falling,
Yeah.
but he always got back up. They never complained and all that. They watched that. And there's something about seeing that as even a youth. And when he coached, obviously, young kids, but also all the way up into high school. He used to coach the Allen varsity summer baseball team, things of that nature. And so the impact that he had on these boys in our community was profound. And when my dad passed away, I can't tell you how many messages I received from people and young, they're now old. I'm old now, but that the impact he had on their life, and some of them wishing they had really told him. So that means a lot to me and my family when we hear stories of that. And what's awesome for us, what they hear and what we hear about him is exactly what we saw.
Right.
We saw patience, we saw kindness, we saw love, we saw inspiring words, we saw encouragement. If anything, my dad was probably the best coach with encouraging people, not just kids, but even adults that sometimes needed a word of encouragement. My dad was incredible with doing that and getting people to feel like they could achieve anything. And sometimes it was just a word or two from my dad that did that for people. And he didn't just coach youth. And I'll give you an example of his giving back without even thinking. He wasn't thinking he was giving back. It was just him. But when we started to fight as a country in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. Obviously, we had a lot of soldiers getting hurt and some would lose limbs, things of that nature. People would call my dad asking if he could just give some words of advice or encouragement to these young soldiers that were newly hurt and not knowing what the life ahead of them was going to be. And my dad could literally just spend even 30 seconds or a minute with somebody and they would go, I got it. I can do this. There's hope. And that's what my dad gave a lot of people was hope, and just incredible. Again, it goes back to we got to see the exact same thing at home. I always wondered, how in the world does he get up with all that adversity? And I'm going to go back to something you mentioned earlier, Greg. Yes, there were little things every day that were so hard for my dad because of the complexities of his injuries. Just getting a shirt on, getting pants on because he wore this prosthetic leg and would have to do this belt. Everything he did, tying a shoe on his prosthetics, all of those things, where it would take you and I just a few minutes, 5 minutes to get ready in the morning. It would take my dad a good 45 minutes to an hour to maneuver himself into a shower and out to the restroom and out, getting dressed, all of the things that you and we take for granted. It took him a long time to be able to accomplish just daily activity. But even when he had to do that, he never complained. And he always was grateful that he got to get up and put his clothes on and was going to get to interact with other people, all those sort of things.
And he never wanted any help from anyone either.
Yeah, he never expected help. I'll give you another great example. I don't even know if I said this in the book. When I was growing up, my dad would never use a handicap parking spot ever.
Wow.
And the reason, and it would take him a long time to walk and a lot of extra effort. You and I walking from, a parking lot into a Walmart or Target or wherever we're going, grocery store, it may take you and I just a minute to get in. It's going to take my dad a lot longer. However, he would always say, somebody needs that parking spot, that handicap parking spot more than he did. That was his mindset. And so he was going to walk longer, just like everybody else, so that he could reserve that spot for somebody that possibly needed it more than him. That was his mindset, which is just incredible. You grow up and you're around that all the time. You can only think, man, somebody's worse off. And that was his way of helping somebody else without physically helping them, but just even doing something like that. Unselfish. Probably the most unselfish person I've ever met.
What a great human spirit. That says an awful lot about him. I want to ask you about this. So there's a letter that he wrote to his local paper at the time, and it was in response to an article that was titled, "We Yell Because We Love Your Children." And in the letter, he states that, quote, "A pat on the back and a word of encouragement do more to motivate a child to excel than a screaming coach ever will," unquote. And the other thing that you mentioned was he made it a point to believe in someone and directly tell either a youth or an adult that you can do it. And that just, to me, that just speaks volumes about him too. There's so many things, but
I think like that letter, people think that you get more out of the stick more than the carrot. And my dad would tell you it's the opposite is true. If you can get people to believe in themselves, and sometimes it's just a word of encouragement, it's a pat on the back, it's, giving them a voice, things of that nature will go a long way to help somebody really lift themselves up. And so he was a big believer in that. He didn't have to yell. And what's crazy, his teams, so just talking about the coaching, his teams always won. They always won. Didn't matter what sport, didn't matter the age of the kids. He would get the most out of his players. And it wasn't through yelling. It was encouraging and really taking the time to teach and coach to each individual kiddo and making them feel valued.
right.
Like they had every kid thought they had the most important role on the team. And that was my dad. So those are things that I learned that I've even been able to implement in my life, not only with my own family, but also in work. is the encouraging word and helping lift and coach people without being a tyrant or some certain things like that. So there's all these things that I watched my dad live and not just say, but through his actions that permeate to people all over the place that they're able to take to work or wherever, or as just as a parent.
And that's one of my favorite things in the book is that he gave those kids confidence. He gave those kids the ability to, like you said, the ability to believe in themselves and not doubt. And I've thought about this a lot. I really wish that not only for myself, but that every kid, every boy would have been able to have a coach and a
Yeah.
mentor like Rick Collins in
Yeah.
their corner to be able to instill that in them. That's what I'm trying to
Yeah.
say.
Yeah. Absolutely. If everybody could be so lucky, that's why I'm the most lucky son. And there's incredible dads out there. I would never take that away from other dads or moms that are just incredible influences on their kids. I can just tell you from my own personal experience, I wake up every day going, oh my gosh, I don't know. I drew the lottery. I won the lottery when it came to a parent, and not just him, but my mom she is incredible. She's still living,
Yeah.
and love her like crazy. But I grew up in a household where they were just like, listen, there's going to be failure. There's going to be tough times, but you can do it. You just got to believe in yourself and don't let anybody dictate to you what you are capable of. And that mindset carried with me all the way growing up, but also anybody that was around my dad, they believed in themselves.
Yep.
Simple as that. And you're right. I wish every kid could have somebody in their life that breathed life into them, like my dad did.
Yep. Yeah, that's a what a great blessing for you, and then for all the lives that he impacted
Yeah.
as well by doing that. So, in addition to his bravery and perseverance, his like we talked about, his daily courage of putting on his prosthetics, and then being a great husband to your mom and a great dad to you and your sister, and the ability to endure such pain on a daily basis. What are you most proud of about your dad?
I think the biggest thing that I'm proud of is one, obviously never quitting. He could have easily packed it in a long time ago. The thing that I'm probably most proud of is his level of love to me, my sister, my mom, anyone around him, his family. He loved unconditionally and he loved like crazy. And he could have easily been bitter or said, woe is me, or just think about himself. I'm so proud of the fact that to see a human being literally live as selfless as he did, and not just know that, hey, we're loved. No, I woke up every day being told I was loved by my dad. My dad would hug me and my sister, kiss and hug my mom, everyone around him. He poured into people. He was intentional with his outpouring of love and support and encouragement of people around him. And for me, that I'm so proud that he was so outwardly able to show that love, where a lot of people who had maybe dealt with things that he had dealt with probably would be way more internally focused versus him. I talk about in the book, one of the chapters is the acronym is family.
Right.
Forget about me, I love you. So literally the acronym, forget about me, I love you, family. And that's the thing I'm most proud of is the love that he poured into everybody. He cared about people that he didn't even have to really know you. He probably loved you and cared about you. If he met you, he cared about how you were doing. And if there was anything that he personally could do or ways to help somebody else. And so I'm just extremely proud of that outward love versus everything being internal for him.
As you should be. He was such a great man, and I'm so glad for this book. Let me ask you just a few more things here, and then we'll get on to the weekend and all that good stuff. But let me talk about our school for just a minute. It's at Texas Tech, and I don't think a lot of people actually know this. We have an incredible Vietnam War Center and an archive,
Yeah.
and there were even some just a couple quick side notes. There were some 20, 30 years ago, there were some Vietnamese officials that came over, they visited, Washington, the White House, whatever, and they wanted to go to Lubbock. And they didn't,
Yeah.
so the people in Washington are like, why do you want to go to Lubbock? And so they wanted to go and see that center. And so to talk about the not continuation of that, but the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated in 1986. And sometime in the late 80s, early 90s, the wall organizer, a guy named Jan Scruggs, actually visited Tech and came to speak, and I went and saw it. You and your dad were able to make the trip to Washington, D.C. to see the Vietnam Memorial Wall and the monument. What was that experience like for both you and your dad?
Oh, man, I get emotional thinking about it, but let me take one step back. That Texas Tech Center, yeah, it's got more archives than any location anywhere on the planet around the Vietnam War and conflict. And so I would encourage anybody, if you get a chance to go, you could spend days there. Somebody like me who's really interested in that war and all the dynamics around it, it's fascinating. But when I was growing up, one of the things I had, and even in my adult life, I had a chance to go to Vietnam, or not Vietnam, sorry, Washington, D.C. several times. And traveling for my dad was pretty difficult. Just getting into a plane and the being able to sit was something that was not easy to do because of his prosthetics and leg and all that. And so they didn't do a whole lot of traveling via flight. Back not too long ago now, probably about 6 years ago, my wife and my kids, we surprised my mom and dad with a trip to Washington, D.C. And I said, I can't wait to take, because they wanted to see everything. Obviously, we wanted to see the Vietnam Wall, Memorial Wall. But we wanted them to have just an incredible experience. And so we flew them first class to DC and got a vehicle to take us around. And then my boys would push my dad and myself, we'd push him in a wheelchair to all the different memorials. And I always knew, just even building up to going to it, I knew I was going to be emotional because I had been to the wall multiple times. And every time when I'm looking at me personally, looking at the 58,000 names on that wall
Mhm.
and thinking those were mere boys and that lost their lives so young. And like I said, some of them had families. Obviously, they had families, but some were married and maybe had little
Right.
kids that didn't get to know their dad. And that always weighed on me emotionally, knowing that my dad's name was not on that wall
Right.
and how close it was to being on that wall.
Yeah.
And I always wondered, what would my dad think? Obviously, I was very fortunate. My dad would talk about Vietnam with me. He wouldn't talk about it to a lot of people, but he would talk about it with me because I would ask him. And we had such a close relationship. He was literally my best friend. And so when we all made it there to the Vietnam War Memorial and we walked down in front of that granite wall and just seeing the gravity of all the names, I think for my dad it was an emotional moment because he knew names on that wall, right? And probably just for him, I'm sure it was pretty emotional. And we just sat there in awe of those names and that wall. And for me, it was very poignant because my kids and my mom and my wife, we were all there to witness that together. And so that was pretty emotional. And I hope that people get a chance to go to that wall and remember those 58,000 plus men and women that are on that wall because they gave to their country and they gave to others the ultimate sacrifice. And I just hope that's never forgotten. But that day, I will never forget that day ever. And I'm so thankful that we made that investment of getting my mom and my dad there to the wall. And it was an incredible day. And that was an incredible moment for us to be there together.
That's an incredible thing. I would say, yeah, 58,000 is probably just scratching the surface with everyone that came back with PTSD and Agent Orange and everything else.
Yeah.
It's a tough deal, but I'm very grateful that that God decided not to put Rick Collins on that wall. Yep.
Yep. No doubt.
So let me ask you. So when you talk in the book about what's your Christmas, and then we mentioned how evident it is that Jesus was just in the heart of your dad every step of the way along his journey. Could you talk about that, please?
Yeah. So I talk about in the book, what is your Christmas? My dad, there's something that he remembers there was a big Bob Hope show in Vietnam in Christmas Eve of 1968. And he wasn't able to be there. He was literally out in the jungle on a night patrol and wasn't able to be at this concert that was done by Bob Hope. And my dad always remembered just the gnawing and painful feeling of, if he gets back alive, how much he's going to invest in Christmas, because that holiday just meant everything to him. Obviously, the birth of his Savior. And so he was always, Christmas in general was always so important to him that it was an investment, right? It was, how can we make this the best Christmas for everyone around? And it was just a joyous occasion. And it's part of that gratefulness that he experienced in his life of having something that he was so passionate about, obviously the birth of Christ, but also having his family around, and then also doing good things for other people. There was a ton of people when I was growing up that didn't have much. And we lived off of my dad's retirement pension from the Army, and we'll never complain. We had riches beyond what we deserved. We knew, but we didn't have a whole lot. But my dad would give every last dollar he could to make sure that kids had a Christmas, even whether it was family members, friends that were in a tough situation. He always did that. And so Christmas to him was so important to invest in. He was passionate about it. Invest in other people and surround yourself with family and help people. That what is your Christmas? Everybody's got that. You've got to figure out what that is. What causes are you passionate about? What would you drop everything for to help somebody else? And so that's why we talk about what's your Christmas, because he would give his last dollar to somebody else to make sure they had a Christmas, because he knew how important that was and how important family was and all that.
Another great part of the legacy. Let me ask you this. So he had such a full life, and we've talked about his faith in the Lord, and then coaching and family, and then the dogs being on the Harley trike, and so I want to ask you this. So how important was your mom Linda to your dad and his
Uh,
vitality?
my mom is an angel. So she met my dad after he had lost his wife and his son, after he had the injuries from Vietnam, and then 6 months in the VA hospital, all the physical. So typically people don't meet somebody who's severely disabled and also potentially emotionally disabled because of catastrophic things that have happened in their life. People typically don't find each other in that setting. My mom was a young, beautiful, happy young lady. And, some would go, oh, why would you be attracted to somebody like Rick Collins? And my mom was. And I'm so thankful because they had me and my sister. But my mom is also the most selfless person. And she literally is an angel on earth, because when you're living with somebody who's disabled, whether they want help or not, there's things that just take longer. There's hospital time, there's surgeries, there's just a lot that go on with that. And my mom is and still is the most incredible, most gracious, beautiful, inside and out person I've ever met. And again, I'll go back to, I don't know how I deserved what the parents that I received, but my dad, he drew the lottery when he met my mom. After all that. And so for her to just be by his side no matter what, and be the most loving, supportive wife, they were so perfect together. I don't know if I've never met anybody that loved each other more as a husband and wife than my mom and my dad. They were almost, obviously, God put them in the same path together, but just incredible. She loved my dad and would do anything for him, and he would do anything for her. And so it was amazing to watch her service around my dad and just helping him in every way, even though he wasn't dependent on her helping to, she enjoyed helping him when she could, and just an incredible human being. There's no doubt about it.
Well,
Linda Collins is she's in the Hall of Fame of wives. I can promise you that.
I know she is. I know how much she's done and how much gets done behind the scenes that, that we don't always maybe appreciate enough or certainly
Yeah.
recognize where the wives and moms are concerned. I have to ask you about this because this is just such an incredible feat to me. But in the book, you mentioned that he could bench press over 400 pounds. That is, if any of us have ever played sports or lifted weights at all or done bench press, we all know you've got to have both feet planted and be able to push up with whatever strength you were
Yes.
given. But how is he able to muster the strength to do that?
I think when he realized early on that his arms and his upper body were going to have to be his legs,
Right.
because that got him in and out of a car. It got him in and out of a chair, in and out of bed. Everything was reliant on his upper body strength. And so I remember when I was little, I would go to the gym with him when I was little, 2 years old, 3 years old. I would tag along to the gym with him. I watched him lift and swim and keep that upper body strong. And as an adult, even over the age of 50, in fact, he may have still been doing over 400-pound bench press after the age of 55. I just turned 50 not long ago, Greg. And there is zero way I can't even imagine. But he put so much emphasis on, listen, I've got to stay strong, because the stronger I am, the longer I'm going to be able to keep my independence out of a wheelchair.
Right.
I'm going to continue to be independent, but to do that, I've got to continue my strength. And so he did that. Talk about people loving my dad. A lot of them, he had a lot of people that were just inspired by him at the gym. You go to the local gym and you see this guy and he doesn't have legs, and he's literally all upper body bench pressing over 400 pounds. And I think he got up to one point, he was probably doing about 475, was just incredible strength. Incredible.
Yeah, that's the legend just it keeps growing.
It's
It's
also
amazing.
it's also how he was able to save that girl's life
Right.
because of that strength.
Yep.
There's no question about it.
It's so amazing to hear that he was able to lift without that
Yeah,
lower body strength. It's mind-boggling. It really is.
exactly. Yep.
So Chad, how do you want people to, if I can talk, how do you want people to feel, or better yet, what do you want someone to take away from your dad's story and apply to their own lives?
I think there's a great question. I think if you look at his life from start to finish, there's an element of perseverance, and then how and why you persevere is there's got to be something that either grounds you, that helps you understand that there is hope. And so I would hope that somebody could see our Lord as part of a big part of it. First and foremost, I think that's one of the things when it seems like the world's against you and there couldn't get it, something couldn't get any worse, realizing that the Lord has got you and that you can get through it. The other thing is just pouring yourself into others in service will definitely help you understand that there are people that are dealing with stuff that could be worse than what you're going through. And I think that's part of why my dad spent all the time he could serving other people, because when you're serving other people, you're not necessarily going to feel sorry for yourself as much. And I think he really built a great roadmap for that. And then just the ultimate piece is how to be a great family member. I talked about being coachable and being a great teammate and all of that. I think my dad was an incredible friend and an incredible family member, and then obviously parent. So I would encourage, I don't care what stage of life you are as a parent, you could learn something from my dad. It doesn't matter if you're brand new at parenting or you're older, how he helped navigate the world is just a great blueprint, playbook, if you will, for life. So I think you'll be inspired by it. If people read the book, Run to the Fire, I think you're going to walk away going, I got to get up and I got to get moving. and there's things to do. And there's things to be proud of, and there's things to be grateful for. And I think that's the real takeaway from the book. There's hope. There's great things ahead for everybody, but you got to get up. You just got to find a way to get back up. So,
Where can listeners go to purchase the book? Is that the best way to get in contact with you? Is that how you want to do that?
yeah, so that you can easily get the book on Amazon. Again, Run to the Fire. Chad Collins is the author of the book. It's Run to the Fire. There's both hard copy. There's also the audio version of the book as well. If people don't want a hard copy, they can certainly listen to it. I would encourage you to get the hard copy, though. It's a lot more fun. We love the cover of the book. And what I always encourage people to do is buy the book, read it, and then share it as a gift to somebody else that really may need it, that could be inspired. They may be going through something really tough. And my dad's story can really help elevate and lift people up. There's no question about it. Then you can also, we have a website, runtothefire.me. You can also see some video about my dad's life and a couple other things there. And then I always get encouraged by hearing other people that have struggled and persevered. I love hearing and seeing their stories as well. So you can reach me at that website as well to share stories of others that may be going through something tough. And I love being able to celebrate those milestones and that perseverance as well.
So our call to action today is twofold, to me at least. One is to be a mentor and make a difference in someone's life. Number two, I was going to say I'm not asking, but honestly, all joking aside, please go buy this incredible book. Take it on your next vacation or your weekend trip. It's not a quick read, but you'll definitely enjoy the story, and you will learn about the phenomenal life of persistence and the incredible man that Rick Collins was, and an enduring legacy that your dad created.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I was, again, very fortunate and blessed without question. Not just me, everybody that knew my dad was blessed by knowing him for sure.
Thank you, Chad, very much for speaking with me today. And again, I'm so grateful for you for personally writing this and sharing all these things. I'm better for reading it, and everyone else who's read it or is going to read it is going to feel pretty much the same way, I would hope.
I appreciate that, Greg, and appreciate the time to share his story, and appreciate you, and your podcast is awesome. I always look forward to hearing all your guests. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. You're the next one. And this has just been an incredible conversation. I can't thank you enough for being my guest today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yes.
Have a great weekend yourself.
You do the same. All right, everyone. Thank you again for listening to the Heroes and Icons podcast with your host, Greg Randolph. Once more, thank you very much to our guest, Chad Collins. You can find the link to Chad's website, runtothefire.me, in the show notes for this podcast. And you can also find the link to buy this amazing book, Run to the Fire, at Amazon. Thank you, everyone, again for listening. Have a great night. God bless.
Thanks, Greg.
Yes, sir.
Great seeing you, my man.
Likewise.